I'm just, don't be afraid to break things. Don't be afraid. It's the number one lesson that I learned. And we talked this just to wrap up our chat today, because this is what we started talking about at the beginning. You asked me what I learned from, or got out of situations with my mentors, my early day mentors, people like Adrian Blue, even later on a little bit, Trent Reznor, like, is don't be afraid to break things. Like, look at how things are being done, figure out how you can leverage technology as an example for ways maybe it wasn't intended for, to set yourself apart from everybody else. And that doesn't mean necessarily that if you're a guitar player, you need to incorporate MIDI pickups and other things. I'm even talking about the way that you use social media or the way that you use Patreon, like, or whatever, literally whatever it is, right? Don't be afraid to kind of think outside the box, not only in your playing, but in the way you approach your business, because those are the people who tend to get opportunities because you're doing something that not everybody else is doing. And that's, that is of a tremendous value. So I think, it's easy.
Daniel Rowland is an LA, Vegas-based music producer, engineer, tech executive, and educator. He holds a BS and MFA in music technology and is currently head of strategy and partnerships at AI music production platform LANDR, co-founder of browser-based DAW Audiotool, and longtime instructor at MTSU. For nearly a decade, his primary focus has been on the empowerment of music creators via ethical AI-driven tools and accessible design, sharing that message on dozens of panels and podcasts. He has produced, mixed, or mastered projects for Pixar, including the Oscar award-winning film Piper, Nine Inch Nails, Seal, Jenna Aiko, Philip Glass, Gale, Gucci Man, Keith Richards, Gwen Stefani, David Foster, Burna Boy, Adrian Belew, and Jason Derulo, along with dozens of soundtracks for Star Wars, Marvel, John Wick, The Fast and the Furious, and others. He was ranked as one of the top 40 mastering engineers in the world by Jasta based on streaming numbers and credits, and is a voting member of the Recording Academy. Daniel and I met when we were both asked to be part of a panel discussion at the NAMM Show 2023 on the future of musical instruments the next 10 years. Later that same year, we were both asked to be part of an AI think tank at Mondo NYC. I've thoroughly enjoyed every interaction I've had with Daniel, and I really enjoyed this conversation too. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did.
I can get up and close a blind. You can tell me when the glare goes away, but yeah, either way,
we're good. That's up to you. You could also turn your Les Paul a little bit. There you go.
I'm trying. Yeah, if it'll stay. Yeah, whatever. Good enough.
That's all right. How you doing?
Good, man. Just putting out fires and saving babies.
Oh, really?
My wife's sick, so I've had. No, I'm joking. My wife's ill, so I've been in meetings all this morning with a 17-month-old. So this is my first one where I've managed to put her to the side.
Right.
I don't think she would be a welcome guest on the podcast.
I might like it. My
Anyway,
grandson's visiting from the other side of the country right now too, but I sent them out for lunch during this one. So
see your grandson?
Yeah.
How is that even possible? All right. Crazy.
Well, you see, eventually your baby will have babies. Yeah. I just had babies.
I won't be around for that. Yeah, exactly. That's my plan.
Yeah, my kids are like 24 and
damn,
26.
dude. I guess I probably knew that, but that blows my mind.
Yeah, they're both married and living 6,000 kilometers in each direction away from me. We live in the middle. Wow. One lives in northern BC and one lives in France. You met Zach, who was running the camera at the NAMM Show.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Zach's my son. He lives in Strasbourg, France, with his wife there. And
cool.
Yeah.
Nice.
Anyways.
Cool.
Yeah. So I'm a little distracted by your guitars, actually, because I saw an interview of you in this room with a different set of guitars, which makes me think you probably have a lot of different guitars going on.
Well, I moved most of them to Vegas. So my nice guitars are all at the new house in Vegas. And here's just like, but this house still, I try to keep it stocked for, if people are coming and recording. Like I think I mentioned, I had somebody here for the past 2 months doing some records. So I tried to have some stuff here. But yeah, man, I can't play as much as I used to because I've had a bunch of elbow arm issues here recently. So I've had a lot of surgeries, but I still appreciate the art, but it's not to the degree that you do, man. I don't even have, you have more knowledge about guitars in your pinky than I have in my whole body.
Oh, well, I suspect it's just different. That's all.
Yeah. Well, very well said.
Different obsessions. Yeah. But, I did enjoy actually looking at them because I had noticed that even your traditional guitars, your your Les Paul and your Stratocaster both had MIDI pickups on them.
Always. That's the Adrian Blue influence on me, right? Coming from the 13 pin, or I guess 25 pin or whatever it was, world first, and into that. So yeah. And I guess I was into that stuff before I started working with him, but afterwards, right, it was just on everything.
Hmm.
So
Hmm. Yeah, that's fascinating to me because actually I don't know a lot of people who use MIDI pickups. It's a technology that didn't get a lot of traction, um, and so
yeah, yeah.
maybe you're surprised to hear that, but because
No, no,
maybe you're
you're
deep in that
right.
niche where everyone has them. But
No, only super nerds. No, totally, man. It was like, you only had Rowland and a couple of other companies like really actively building guitar synthesizers and some quirky stuff here and there. It's when, I think when Fishman got into it, God, it's probably been almost 10 years ago now, with things like the triple play, where it was like smaller and Bluetooth, is easier to kind of incorporate into Godins and other guitars without having to have this, the 13 pin thing where you need a special interface and blah, blah, blah. You could just plug it into your computer with a USB stick. That was the way to go for sure. But you're right. It's
yeah,
still incredibly niche. And now there's plugins that do that, right? You don't even need, just go, regular quarter-inch in, and you can do pretty solid polyphonic, audio MIDI conversion these days. So
hmm, hmm.
bells
And
and
is
whistles.
the tracking reasonable?
It's reasonable, yeah. I mean, is it as good as having a hexaphonic pickup? It's not, but it's passable for a lot of things, I have to say. So it's cool, and it makes sense. I mean, you look at things like Salamoni's Melodyne over the years, even though it's not real time, or even video games like Rocksmith. I don't know if you've ever played that, but like, you plug your guitar into your PlayStation, and
Hmm.
it does pretty amazing polyphonic detection of what you're playing and instructing you on scales and gamifying things and playing Rush songs and all that kind of good stuff. So it should exist in the DAW at this point, and it does decently.
Oh, that's really interesting because actually I'm not particularly familiar with that, but the idea. I wonder if we could actually many years later have a revolution in that because it wouldn't be the first time. I mean, as a matter of fact, the guitar on your left there, was taken out of production because it wasn't successful at first, and it was many years later that the Les Paul took off with a different
Yep.
group of people than it was initially marketed to. And so, what do you think? Are we holding out? Do you think that the MIDI pickup will have its day yet?
No, I don't think it will have
No.
its day for whatever. No, it's not going to have its day. I mean, I think it's fascinating, like where AI has taken us. It's we've kind of moved even beyond the idea that I would just want to my guitar to be converted to MIDI to play a piano or something or synth, which is kind of the
Right.
traditional use of that kind of stuff. Now we're into the timbre transfer space where it's like, no, I just record my guitar as it is and I press a button and it becomes a cello and it becomes a string section. It never sees MIDI, right? It's just a
Hmm.
neural network that's actually applying the timbre of one instrument onto another. And that's kind of where we're at now. So is that, and that there's even some real time stuff for that. So I think that's kind of where all this heads. Um, bypassing kind of MIDI and spurious note detection and all the stuff that kind of comes with that.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, that's interesting. We should Ed Keller, who you met when we did the Mondo NYC
Hmm.
together. Ed just did a project in Madrid capturing, like doing motion capture on the gesture with a bunch of musicians, and guitar
Oh,
was one
that's
of
cool.
those things. So they can get the micro gestures in there. Because I suspect that, we're only able to track so much of the movement, and it's the subtleties and the subtle nuances that make the difference from one player to the next when it comes to a stringed instrument, right? And
100%.
so,
Yeah, that's cool. Wow.
yeah, yeah, yeah. There's so much happening right now in that space that
It's crazy.
it's why I love interacting with people like yourself, where we're both in music, but we're on two different tracks most of the time, and sometimes we'll get a chance to interact together. And but you say things, and you talk about things, and you're thinking about things every day that aren't a part of my daily consciousness. And one of the things that is super fascinating to me is your life in tech and with DAWs and recording and mastering, and then to see the bridge that sits behind you, no pun really intended,
Nice.
with the MIDI pickup, because we do talk about the guitar as an interface, and you and I have talked about the guitar as sort of an older technology as an interface, and how it relates to the what it's like creating music on a DAW versus creating on a traditional stringed instrument, which I think we can safely even say the electric guitar now is a traditional stringed instrument. And yeah, but you have used the guitar as a computer interface to play other instruments.
Yeah, for decades now. Yeah, it's been. I mean, obviously, people that certainly doing it a lot longer than I have. It's my first. When I was an undergrad, I did an undergraduate research project, and it was building some software in Max MSP to do, um, audio to MIDI conversion. It was literally the first thing that I did when I was a student. For some reason, I did it with a theremin I built. Actually, I've got a theremin over here that I put together and did that, and then applied it to
Hmm.
guitar and other things. Obviously, people way smarter than me were building things way cooler, but it was kind of, yeah, I don't know. That was guitar has always been my instrument to speak through, right? It's the thing that I've always been the most adept at beyond piano and anything else. So I always wanted to kind of have that be the input source, no matter what I wanted the output to be. So it's always been a bit of a journey and a battle to make that happen.
Sure. I mean, there's so did you start as a guitar player? Is that your first musical instrument,
Yep.
or you started
Yeah,
there?
absolutely. Like a lot of
Yeah.
people have, like 15, that era, right? That age kind of
Yeah.
got into it there, man, and have been doing it now for, 30 years or so.
Yeah. 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 That's great. So do you mind sort of telling me what your musical sort of journey was? We've we've hung out a few times. We've done some panels together, but actually, I don't know. We've got to know each other particularly well at this point. And so,
Yeah.
how do we get to this point? I mean, your resume is packed full of a lot of interesting things that I read out at the beginning of this podcast. But how do you go from 15-year-old kid to where you are today, or how did you even pick up the instrument in the first place? Is there music in your
Yeah,
family?
I mean, no, music really not so much in my family. My grandfather was, well, actually, my grandfather was the trumpet player and headed a big band in Charleston, South Carolina, where I'm from. So he was
Hmm.
pretty entrenched in the music scene, but it didn't really, my father dabbled, but it wasn't part of our music, was not something that was part of our daily lives. And like a lot of kids, I started when I was 6, and, people start piano and various things. I started guitar then and dropped it and picked it back up in high
Hmm.
school because I was fucking awkward and anxious and didn't have a lot of friends. And, that it became kind of my, besides the fact that I loved it and I was super into Beatles and Zeppelin and all that kind of stuff and wanted to play that music, it was my way to kind of speak, and be comfortable speaking when I wasn't really comfortable in the traditional sense. And it really worked for me, as I was kind of getting my stuff together as an adult as well in that regard. So it's, yeah, it was interesting, but that's how I started, and I played pretty much in bar bands from the age of 15. Playing in like a lot of people in clubs I wasn't supposed to be in, 2 or 3 days a week until I was probably 25. So for about 10 years, I made my living as a guitar player, lead guitar player kind of thing. And this was back, and I mean, I'm, you know, 47, so this was in the days of the grunge and Pearl Jam and Alice in Chains and all of that. So we were very much in that vein as a lot of people were, but
Hmm.
made a
Hmm.
pretty decent living 3 or 4 or 5 days a week eventually gigging. And but I was also like managing grocery stores and doing day job stuff, right? I didn't have any aspiration of ever even recording albums. Like it's interesting to think back on now. I wasn't trying to be an artist. I was just enjoying drinking a lot, making money, and playing in bars, and being a kid. So that's kind
Hmm.
of how I got started. And I knew nothing about music technology at all. I couldn't set a guitar up. I didn't know anything about recording it all. I mean, I'd bought a couple 4 tracks, but it was mostly my friends that were messing around with that. So it got to the point, like I said, where I was about 25, and I've been doing this for about 10 years. And it was, I've said this before, it's like I needed to go to rehab or go to college. So I decided, I would go to college. Right. And I randomly looked up, like, I didn't know how to use it. I was like a savant with computers when I was a kid. My parents bought Apple computers like in the early 80s, like, so
Hmm.
before a lot
Hmm.
of people had them, and I'd done programming and built stuff, and I'd lost all of that for a big chunk of my life. So I was largely computer illiterate at this point. But anyway, long story short, I found a music technology program online because I didn't want to go to school for jazz and I didn't want to go to school for classical stuff. Yeah, but so
Hmm.
music tech recording seemed to kind of be something that was adjacent. And I ended up at University of North Carolina at Asheville at about the age of 26, and got my undergrad there, and then eventually went to grad school. And that kind of launched me into the wider music industry, kind of going to school and becoming a professor first. So I really, not to be long winded, but I came into the music industry ass backwards, where it was like I started as a bar band guy. Then I went to
Hmm.
college for 7 years, right, to get my master's of fine arts in music technology, began
Hmm.
teaching while I was in school, and then started working professionally later based upon the people that I met while I was teaching. It's how I met Adrian Ballou, who was kind of my really the funnel for me into the music industry.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. So much to unpack there, and I completely irrelevant to most people. But Charleston, South Carolina. Did you go to Ye Old
Yeah.
Music Shop?
Oh my
Do you know
god.
Michael down there?
Dude, yes, he probably wanted to kick me out of his shop, numerous times. I have not heard the name Yield Music Shop in a long time. So, but
Yeah,
yes,
yeah, yeah.
that's crazy.
Part of my background is I literally went everywhere with guitars, and so I've been in more than 600 guitar shops in the U.S. alone.
Jesus.
Every
Okay.
state, every province in Canada, much of Europe, and so, anyways, every town reminds me of some guitar shop. And
Some
anyways,
guitar shop. I love it.
Michael was a nice guy. I like Michael and the
Yeah.
old music shop. Anyways, and Asheville, you went from
Yeah.
there to Asheville, which is a great city also, and a good arts community
Great
there
city.
also.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
still love Asheville. Haven't been back for a minute, and then ended up from Asheville to just outside of Nashville in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, where MTSU,
Yep.
Middle Tennessee State is, which is like a 30,000 student school that I'd never even heard of at the time, biggest school in that
Mhm.
state, and have a pretty well regarded music program that I again went to for grad school and started. They offered me a deal I couldn't refuse, which was we'll pay for your tuition and give you some money every month if you like teach a couple classes. And I was petrified on stage. I was petrified performing on stage for years. I would perform with my back to the audience as the lead guitar player for a big chunk of my
Really?
career. People actually thought I was like, when I was young, right? I got over that
Yeah.
obviously when I got into my 20s, but people
Uh-huh.
thought I was like tied to bore. So I was like being very mysterious about what I was doing when I was just nervous. So it became like this kind of interesting vibe that whatever I created unintentionally. But anyway, so yeah, that's I
Yeah.
ended up in Tennessee and was in Tennessee for about 10 years, again, where I met Blue and a number of other artists, and then eventually made my way out to Los Angeles, that's where I am right now. And I'm, we've talked about, I'm splitting time between in here, West Hollywood. I've got a studio on Sunset Strip just behind the Whiskey A Go Go, and then recently bought a place in Las Vegas. So I'm getting my studio Atmos room and all that kind of stuff set up there.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah,
That's
it's been
great.
cool.
Yeah, yeah. And so you spent time teaching. You spent time working then, I presume, in Murfreesboro and the Nashville-ish sort of scene overall, or
No, strangely enough, man,
no?
like I have such a weird, yeah, my journey is
It's one of the biggest
everyone's journey
recording
is weird.
markets in the world.
Did
And
nothing in Nashville,
didn't happen.
nothing in
Wow.
Nashville. So, well, I never tried. So basically what happened is, and whether this is interesting or not, it's like I was again teaching college there, right? Teaching kids how to make music, even though, I'd been doing it as an amateur creator, but not somebody like,
Yeah.
on really a serious professional level. And I would rent studios in Nashville all the time and take my students there, and we'd learn large format consoles. I mean, we went all over the city. So that was vibey, but I didn't really work in those studios because I wasn't working in country music predominantly, especially
Mhm.
this, 15 years ago, or Christian music or anything like that. It's when I went to
Yeah.
Adrian Blue has a studio just outside of Nashville in Mount Juliet. And I basically built, came in as a guitar. It's a long story, but came in as a guitar
Mhm.
tech, moved up to building his studio, became his engineer, became his co-producer on everything over the years, and predominantly worked with one artist the entire time I was in Nashville, or artists maybe he was producing that I was involved with. So it was largely
Mhm.
we could have been anywhere in the world. Like, it had nothing to do with us actually being in Nashville, Tennessee, which is weird because Nashville, of course, as you said, is like a
Yeah.
massive hub for music that I was
Yeah.
largely not involved in.
Yeah. Oh,
So I
that's
was doing
amazing.
progressive rock in Nashville.
Yeah, but there's lots of, I mean, I know Nashville's known for
Sure,
country, but there's lots of progressive rock bands that are in the surrounding area also in Nashville. I mean, there's definitely, I mean, I'm
sure.
blanking to name any, but I mean, well, I mean, Paramore is a, pop punk band that came out of
Yep.
that area also, and one of my favorite bands, which is hardly known, called Fleming and John, a husband and wife duo, which
I don't
are
know.
fantastic, are out of there. You should check them out. Um, and that's John Mark Painter, who's a producer also. He worked with all the Ben Folds 5 stuff. He does all the
Oh,
arrangements
that's
on it,
cool.
and he did the soundtrack for Hoodwinked and Indigo Girls, and anyways, he's a
Oh, wow.
fascinating
Okay, stuff I dig.
instrumentalist.
Cool.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so, you know what? It was his wife is a singer. He does really fascinating stuff, and they'll do like a disco song, but it'll like open up with like an Irish like bow ran, and it's all acoustic instruments that he's made like this discotheque song out of, and it's fascinating instrumental stuff. And you mentioned the Christian rock stuff that was big back when you were there also, and
Yep.
the band called DC Talk had a huge
Of course.
hit
I've
called "What If I
Yeah.
Stumble," and that "What If I Stumble" was a crossover song for them and It's got mandolin and strings and everything, and that's a John Mark Painter produced song also. Anyways,
Oh, I work
check out
work with
John
some
Mark
members of
Painter.
that band. Yeah, I will definitely do. But you're right. Nashville has, especially nowadays, right, has a lot more to offer than just country music. And hey, all these country players are shredders in their own right, and they're off playing jazz
Yeah.
gigs, and they're off doing progressive. Like they're so much broader than what you see if you go to Broadway and walk into a country bar, right? So they're pretty well rounded, obviously, and amazing musicians. Nashville, everyone says it, but is the city when you go to a restaurant and the wait staff is probably all better musicians than you. But
Yes.
it's a daunting city to kind of make your way in as an engineer, producer, or a musician. But good vibe, good people. I still have an apartment there in Adrian's studio, but I haven't been back there in years.
Right, right. Well, great.
Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop is your premier fretted instrument custom case maker, and we invite you to create a musical instrument case unlike any other, one that's unique to you. Every Cedar Creek custom case is hand-built by highly skilled craftspeople using only select woods, Providence Forge hardware, and premium instrument-friendly materials. At Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop, we are dedicated to helping you design the case of your dreams. Find out more at cedarcreekcases.com.
What is
Mhm.
what would you say was what do you take with you from that time? I mean, probably a whole lot, but if you had to sort of narrow it down and communicate what you learned by coming into the studio with someone like Adrian Belew and growing up,
Yeah,
maturing in that scene, what was sort of
yeah, man.
the defining characteristic of that?
Yeah, it's interesting because like I was already kind of experimenting with music, and I thought I was at least right with MIDI guitar and with some sound design and complex MIDI setups for Ableton and all this kind of stuff. But I think for anyone, right? If you can, the goal is to get around people who are doing stuff at a level above what you are, right? So you can learn. And Adrian
Hmm.
was like 30 levels above me. So to really be, regardless of what he makes, some very traditional pop music and some very, very outside the box stuff, right? And I think to
Hmm.
be with somebody who is so varied in his love for the Beatles and then his love of just wacky sound design and everything in between, and to see the creative output of somebody like that who's an art, visual artist and a musician and all this different stuff was yeah it's it felt really natural as a way to kind of fit into that world, but ultimately I was just kind of constantly learning, and vice versa. Like he would tell you that as far as like all the various pieces of technology that I was able to bring to the table software wise, because he comes from a world of 30 years of hardware devices, right? And I
Hmm.
got to learn about things I didn't even know existed, and things that David
Yeah.
Bowie had given him and Trent Reznor had given him, and all this custom stuff, man, that was amazing. So like he kind of had the hardware thing on lock, right? And I didn't. And then I had the software thing down. And we kind of merged the two worlds. So it was, I
Yeah.
think I both would say we got a lot out of it, but definitely much for me. And through him, I mean, that's how I got to work with Trent Reznor. That's how I got to work with people that I also idolized and always wanted to kind of get to hang around and pick their brains and stuff. So it was, yeah, if I had to point to one person that I've met in my life that's responsible for where I'm at now, it would be him. If that meeting had not happened, I don't know what I would be doing. Engineering in Nashville, doing something, but not what I'm doing now.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Hmm. I love to, most of us who are in the music industry who are not making a living playing guitar, which there are very, very few of,
Sure.
we all come to it in a bit of a sideways kind of manner.
Yep.
What I'm doing now, of course, when I was 15 years old, I also thought I would be a professional musician. I would walk my dog with my guitar. Like I wouldn't
Nice.
put it down. You'd fall asleep and
Yep.
you'd wake up at like 1:30 in the morning and your guitar would be on you on your bed and your neck would be stiff. You'd put your guitar back down, climb
That's
into
funny.
bed because it was obsessive, at that time. And,
Yep.
and there was just no imagination that it wasn't going to work out. Like you were just gonna be a musician the rest of your life. And I I don't it sounds like a bit of a sad tale. It's not at all. I'm very happy with
No.
where I am and what I do in my life. And I suspect you are also, but the path to it, people always want to know, "Oh, how'd you end up doing what you do?" And it's never a straight line, ever. There's
No, and it's interesting. One of the reasons, and I was the same way. Obviously, I think a lot of
yeah.
people probably even listening to this, watching this, are or were. It's when you don't know how wide the world is, it's easy to have a very singular focus, right? Of like,
Mhm, mhm.
so it's and I run into this I mean, I've been a full time college professor now for almost 15 years, and it's like I see that with my students. They come into school and they only know, okay, they know the guitar, or they like to make beats, or they like to sing or rap, and
Mhm,
that's been their
mhm.
passion since they were a kid. And as they start to learn about the opportunities out there to make a living in the post production industry, as an example, or live sound or game audio or all these other things, it's not that they failed at the thing that they started out wanting to do. It's that they just expanded their horizons so dramatically. They realized the things that they were passionate of, that drew them to the guitar or to music production, can be applied to a lot of other things that may also interest them as they grow and mature in their career and their knowledge base, right? So I don't always look at it like you said. It's not always a bad thing. I'm the same way. I mean, I think I enjoy what I do now more than I would if I was a session player or something like that, if I had,
Mhm.
even reached the pinnacle of that. So it's yeah, I think it's a good thing, and I think it's something that everyone has to go through at some point, right? As you land where you're going to land, regardless of kind of where you started.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I've been thinking about this, sort of refining, sort of funneling effect that
Hmm.
happens throughout movements. So, you mentioned in your education that you thought you needed to either go to school or go to rehab, and that going to school you didn't want to become a classical musician, you didn't want to take a jazz guitarist, and when you say that, what we're talking is these are the institutionalized versions of what
Yes.
you could do as a guitar player, right?
Yeah.
And what
Not
that
that I didn't
is
love
that
jazz. It's that I didn't want to go to school for it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But the reason those are the institutionalized versions is because those movements have, well, they're kind of closed. We know everything there is for the most part to say about them. I know that people are going to be pissed off at me for saying that, but
Uh-oh.
hear me out here for a second. Every school of thought, every new idea, which is what a musical genre is. So we have a new exploration, new ideas. We go in that direction and we explore everything there is about it. And there's this, when it's exciting and when it's the right time, that takes off and it blossoms. And there's all sorts of musicians trying all sorts of amazing different things. They're playing off of each other and people are inspired and culture gets involved. And there's this big blossoming that happens. But eventually, everything that can be said or written on the topic is said. And that's sort of the closing. In the art world, we call that an oeuvre, where we have the Nouveau period and the Deco period and the Cubist period. And, eventually we kind of explore every concept within Cubism, that we can explore, and the conversations are done. Musically speaking, we then start to say things like, everything kind of sounds the same. There's no good new music
Right.
happening within that genre anymore. And that's the closing of the oeuvre. And I don't think it's a bad thing because there's always a new thought. There's always a new music coming along. Although most people tend to live their life in that particular movement, right? We can see it
Sure.
by how their hair is, by what they choose to wear, and what their conversations are. We can tell when they were roughly
Yeah.
15 to 23 years old. There's some that sticks to us somehow. We listen to that
Sure.
kind of music for the rest of our lives. Most people do. Um, and so, but what happens is that at the top of it, there's all these great variances. And then as we sort of refine them, we sort of tuck in and we sort of we make heroes within it, and we sort of say that's the sound of rock guitar, that's the ideal rock player, and we eventually sort of make an icon and we reenact the hero who is the ultimate one,
Right.
right? And we have now, if you saw somebody pull out, if you're at a cafe and there's a small stage there and someone pulls out a 175 or an L5, you're thinking, I'm about to hear jazz. Right? Like,
Yep.
it's so iconic at that point. You'd be shocked if you didn't hear someone playing jazz on that guitar, and a nylon string guitar we call a classical guitar, right? Of F-hole guitar we call, for the most part, a jazz guitar. It's not as if you can't play any other music on them, but they become known for that, and they're sort of icons
Right.
of that movement. And so, um, but professionally speaking, and creatively speaking, it can be a trap,
Of
right? To
course.
define yourself so much. And so you and I had a conversation recently when we are both at the NAM show about the freedoms that come along with technology and with something like a DAW, um, and, and recording within a computer system. I mean, when we had a 4-track we 4 tracks. What are we going to do with that, right? We
Yep.
had to be very specific about what we were doing with it. Um, and so I'm gonna try and tie this together now. So that sort of funneling that we try and avoid times, to be able to keep your mind open and to be able to transition from one movement to the next, I think requires you to be able to see the bigger picture all the time. So there's an
Yep.
example where we used to have ice boxes and people would cut ice from the frozen lakes. There's one to my left, a frozen lake right now. I'm up in Canada. And when the refrigerator was invented, all of the ice cutters went out of business
Sure.
because they were in the ice cutting business. But nobody gave a damn about their ice. They didn't want their milk to go bad.
Right.
Had they seen themselves as in the food preservation business, they could have transitioned from cutting ice to refrigeration. And so I always keep this kind of thinking in mind to make sure I don't call myself an ice cutter. You know what I mean?
Nice. No, it's very like the Luddite thing. Yeah, I mean it's interesting. And how many of them were shaking their fist at the refrigerator guys on their lawn,
Right.
as opposed
Technology.
to yeah, but I get that, boy, and especially in music, man. Like I've said this before, and it's maybe a little bit extreme, but we fetishize the past in music more so than a lot of the other entertainment industries even do, right? To the point that we
Mhm.
can really be obstinate to new technology and to change, even if if it's a new guitar design or it's new digital technology or it's AI or whatever it is, right? We can plugins, it's we can also often be the last to adopt that, but technology is kind of oftentimes the harbinger of change, right? I mean, whether it's and it affects art, right? I mean, we get outside the music industry, look at the invention of the camera and what that did to painting, right? Where painting was a very
Mhm.
realistic type thing. The now everybody can take a picture, so then art goes off in a completely different direction where we're recreating, scenes as real life was not in vogue anymore, right? Is in reaction to
Mhm.
technology. So I don't think it's always bad. I think two things can kind of, you can blend them together. They can live kind of in parallel on their own path. It's fascinating, but I think if you're completely unaware of anything or we're just not interested in learning or knowing what's going on, even if you don't like it, then you kind of miss out on that, right? You just kind of are kind of set doing the same thing over and over, and there's nothing wrong with that. But
Mhm.
if that's the case and the world passes you by, don't get mad about it, regardless of if you're in music or any other field.
Yeah. Yeah. I couldn't agree more. And we hear a lot of talk about, well, there's a lot of posts on our social media that talk about the record industry and how musicians aren't getting paid and getting screwed over
Sure.
on this stuff. And this is it's a difficult conversation to be had, but nobody when we're in business and our own commerce, nobody owes us a pile of
Right.
money somewhere. There's an economic scheme that's at work. And at one point in time, there was wealthy people who went around and said, "Oh, I like that sound that's happening in Memphis." They would dig that sound in Detroit, but they can't hear it yet. And so there's an opportunity here for me to take a new technology and record that Memphis sound and
Right.
bring it to the people in Detroit. But that was a technological opportunity and an opportunity for entrepreneurs, and that system only lasted as long as there was no access to it, right? But now that we have sort of a decentralization of access to information, to sound, to visuals, I mean, you and I here are talking on a couple $1,000s worth of equipment, and well, your computer is probably worth a lot more than that. But I'm I'm on a MacBook Air and I'm using my iPhone as the camera, and there's a few
Oh
thousand
yeah.
dollars worth of equipment here, and we're casting, thousands of miles apart from each other, and it just works.
Yep.
But the that those are always limited opportunities, and to sort of dig yourself in and say, it needs to return to the way it used to be, it's just not very realistic, and it completely ignores the concept of creative destruction. You familiar with the economic concept of creative destruction?
Um. Go ahead. No.
That's okay. So Joseph Schumpeter, a famous Austrian economist, talks about this idea that, let's use an example that we all would know, like the automobile. The automobile, of course, changed the whole world, you know. But when the automobile came in, there were hundreds of thousands of people that were farriers. You know, they
Sure.
made horseshoes.
Horse and
You
buggy,
know,
all that stuff. Yeah, yeah.
they made horses. There was a huge horse and buggy industry up in Michigan, actually, up in Detroit and that sort of area. It's actually the reason that all the Gibson guitar factory was up there, and the maple, because actually there was a bunch of talented wood people who were building horse carriages in the area,
Right.
the same
Cool.
the same area, same skill sets, and so, anyways, you know, you think, oh no, all the blacksmiths are going to go to business. Oh no, all the saddle makers are going to go to business. But they didn't really go to business. They started,
They pivoted.
making iron spokes for cars, and they made car seats, with leather, and they just transitioned with the new technology. And so, the only reasonable conclusion when we have technological changes like this is that things will just continue to change. They will continue to evolve. And there's no point in bemoaning the past. I mean, I have sympathy for it, don't get me wrong. But I
Sure.
mean, come on. It was never reasonable to think that you had a really good, or that I had a really good chance of making millions and millions of dollars playing guitar. That was the dream. But so very
Right.
few people ever got to actually do that, right? And so, there's new ways to do it. There's new ways to sort of carry on, and nobody owes it to you. You gotta make your own. You gotta make your own future here. That's why I do what I do. That's what you do, right? We found a way. We acquired skills that people will pay us for, and we stick
Yeah.
close to our creative capacities. And now
Yep.
I don't
Our
know. Did I
strengths.
did I uh, did I say some bad words there?
No, no, and I use the car, I mean, analogy all the time. It's interesting. It doesn't mean like we all honor the past. We all know how to play, all the music that came before us, blah blah blah, that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's I do a lot of the speaking that I do is with people who are very anxious about new technology, right? Having now been in the AI space in some form or fashion, in the music AI space for almost a decade, right? It's been
Hmm.
like early days of this stuff when people were like pitchforks in the streets about this type of stuff. I mean, really
Hmm.
angry, like hard to even have a conversation with somebody without them just like freaking out. Um,
Yeah.
if we would still be drawing on walls in caves, right? If we didn't embrace new technology to some degree and understand that it was going to happen and we have to kind of learn to pivot and control it and all this kind of stuff. So it's
Hmm.
it's always fascinating to me people's opinions, some right and some wrong and some very subjective about new tech. I mean, the it's interesting. I mean, we talk about like, wow, we dreamt of being guitar players getting paid millions of dollars. Well, the ability to achieve that largely was not in your hands, right? It was dependent upon the business, the entrepreneurs that you were talking about,
Hmm.
kind of swooping in and finding you and giving you access to this big machine that would allow you to become that thing. So, with the democratization that social media and digital technology has brought, largely, if you want to achieve that, you can kind of do that on your own if you want to, right? But that tech is not for everybody, right? And if you didn't
Hmm.
grow up with it, it's much harder to kind of come into that ecosystem and do that. And it's very saturated at this point. I don't want to. This is beyond even our discussion, but I think we're about to see a really interesting return to kind of away from large platforms that you feel like you're just in a sea of other people doing the same thing, whether it's a DSP or it's a YouTube or it's something like that. I think
Hmm. Hmm.
particularly with the toxicity around social media, with AI becoming such a big thing and video and audio and everything else, where authenticity is always going to be in question. I think a
Hmm.
return to kind of more localized micro communities around where you don't need, you've heard that you just need 1,000 fans thing, but where that
Hmm.
actually becomes a little bit more of a reality and people can kind of own the relationship with the people that support them in the creative arts. So I think we're about to see kind of almost a return to the way the internet started, where it was kind of fragmented and it wasn't, these massive global
Yeah.
platforms that everyone participated in. So things are cyclical as well, right? So I think
Hmm.
it's we're going to see people who are largely shut out from the way that the current industry works kind of be welcomed back in sort of a different door here in the next 3 to 5 years. Again, a tangent, but I think there's some cool stuff that's going to be going on as a result, again, of technology changing.
Hmm. Well, I completely agree with you. I was interviewed a couple of weeks ago by some people who have honestly a relatively small podcast, uh, of luthiers, like people who repair guitars primarily,
Yep.
and some of them are guitar makers, and they have this channel they just leave open all the time. It's like this social. They're fixing guitars and they're talking to each other, and they leave it
Cool.
open all the time. And they interview people once or twice a week. And they had me on it, and he told me that his Patreon, when he released the Patreon, it from the beginning made enough money for him to focus 100% on that. And it's like 800 followers.
Yep.
That is not a large group. That is a small group of people who are willing to pay a little bit more to have direct access to exactly what
Sure.
they want. And I think that's what I thought of when you mentioned, moving away from these large
Sure.
scales where it's very, very, lost in a sea of people, I believe is how you described it.
Yep.
And the internet can be that also, where it provides all of these very specialized groups. There may only be 100 people in the world who are interested in that, but you can actually find each other on the internet.
Yeah, and if they got $5 a month or $10 a month, you can at least have a middle class is living off of that relationship with them.
Yeah.
Um, again, it's all about providing value over the long term and churn and all of this other stuff that even businesses deal with. But no,
Mm-hmm.
totally agreed, man. And it's we're again, think about the way that if you're a musician right now, what is your path to achieving whatever level of success you deem to be success, right? Largely it's through releasing music on DSPs, right? Through streaming services,
Mm-hmm.
and of course touring and all the other things that come with that. But in those cases, and this has been said before, you
Mm-hmm.
don't even know who's listening to your music. You have
Right.
no idea. You have no way to access them, no way to cross sell them to other things that you're doing unless said platform allows you to do that. They own that relationship because they're the ones monetizing your music and those users.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it's completely a failed system in this regard at this point. But it doesn't, not a completely failed system, but there are alternatives that can again run in parallel with that. I met with a company, I won't even name them, this week. That's, windowing is a big thing where, okay, if I'm going to release a song, and we're kind of off on a tangent here, I don't have to put it on Spotify today. I could have
Mm-hmm.
a Patreon or even set up my own thing. There's some, interesting kind of Bandcamp alternatives now where if
Mm-hmm.
people want early access, even if it's 50 people, right, and are willing to pay a little more for early access to my music or early access to my merch or for experiences that I can't just get through Spotify, which is largely passive listening through playlists, you can do that. And then your music ends up on Spotify for everybody else at some point, and you get the exposure from that and a little trickle of income. But there's ways that you can kind of own relationships with your true super fans, right? Is kind of the word for 2024. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that there are those micro communities I was talking about that actually can provide a decent living for artists that there is not a way to do through kind of the traditional means of release at this point.
The Boutique Guitar Showcase on tour will make its first ever Asian appearance at Sound Meso Osaka in Osaka, Japan, May 11th and 12th, 2024. You can experience many incredible, unique, world-class guitars, meet some of their makers, and speak with me, Jamie Gale, the curator of the Boutique Guitar Showcase, at this landmark event. Find out more at boutiqueguitarshowcase.com.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a bit of the, I don't know if irony is the right word there, but, before record labels, you needed a patron. That
Yeah,
is how a lot of the
sure.
great art in the history was made,
Right.
and we sort of
The
moved
Medici,
back to
yeah.
a patron model in through
Sure,
the
man.
computer. But they don't have to be extremely wealthy. You can have patrons who can afford to, as you said, give you $5 a month and enough of them,
Yep.
and they're the ones who make the art happen, and that's yeah, a fascinating model. And so, oh, so much to say there. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And certainly, again, it's nothing new under the sun, but it's I, yeah, especially not to keep harping on the music DSP things, but as people see
Mhm.
Spotify do things like, hey, we're not going to pay you any more money. We're not going to pay you unless you have over 1,000 streams. We're not, and there's a reason business wise why they do that type of stuff.
Yeah,
That the rise of AI generated music and assisted music, all of that is going to see this kind of bifurcation of the way that you engage with distributing your music through
hmm
DSPs and then through more independent platforms focused on independent artists. So I kind of rambling, but it's a direct result of new technology cropping up and allowing those things to happen by making the established players adjust their business models and adjust the way that they deal with content. And it's why streaming even exists, right? Is because that was something that technology allowed to exist, and we know the music
yeah.
industry did not pivot in time for that. They're definitely trying to keep an eye on what's happening now so that doesn't happen again. So
Well, we go back to that sort of reference I made to the ice cutters in this scenario,
Right.
where, why do we do that? And I don't know that I've thought a lot about this, but with Napster, the first time I remember people actually sharing each other's music, um, I mean, it just made it possible for us to, not just go over to a friend's place and borrow an album. Like you could
Right.
now just share your whole library with each other back and forth. And that to me is a pretty, you know, somewhat naive and nice, friendly thing to be doing with each other. It's when you get into the economics of it that it becomes complicated.
Right. We
Uh,
didn't feel like
but
thieves back then. I didn't feel like a thief, but I didn't realize the
no.
repercussions of what I was doing, and most people didn't.
Yeah. No, and that's exactly it, and I remember artists talking about people being entitled and such, feeling that
Yep.
they had a right to the music and such, but, really, if you walked across the street or visited your cousin or someone of the sort and they said, "Hey, check out this album," they let you take it home, no one got paid royalties for that, at one point in time,
Right.
but I guess, you didn't
It's the
own it,
scale of it, right?
but
It's
it was the
all about
scale of it.
scale.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the same thing
Yeah.
with AI generated music. It's not like this idea that, people will use an analogy where it's like, well, if AI people are really upset about AI getting trained on copyrighted material, right? AI is
Yeah.
learning, how to make Beatles songs because it's actually training on Revolver or something like that.
Right.
Well, that's no different than me putting on the Revolver album and learning how to play all the songs, right? I'm training myself off of their stuff. Like, where's the difference? Well,
Yeah.
the difference is the scale of what AI can then do with that data far
Yeah.
surpasses what you as an individual can do with that, right? So there's, it's same thing with the Napster deal. Like, yes, it is similar to going across, to your friend's house and borrowing a record, but that is not going to decimate an industry the way that scale can do on whether it's file sharing or it's on the artificial intelligence generative AI side of things.
Yeah. Of course, we have this conversation in the guitar industry a lot also because, there's copyrights and patents on looks of things as well to a certain extent and designs.
Hmm.
Um, but I don't understand how we can evolve and keep hard copyrights and patents on things because,
Yep.
every Gibson guitar through the 1960s, all the electric guitars had an ES in front of them. It was the electro Spanish guitar. It's all based on the work of Torres, from like 1850, down in Almeria, Spain, and nobody was paying the Torres family, for using the
Right.
ES on there, right? But we referenced that that's where that came from, just the fifths and the particular way we build the guitar and such, it evolved from that space. Um, but yet there are certain companies who will sue anybody who looks anything like them,
Sure.
and I've actually tried to chart this out with Guitar Evolution, and I came up with there was a big chasm. So I took, if I can, you'll bear with me, I'll get geeky on
Please.
guitar here for a
Super
second.
interesting.
So, and I think you, in the first time we met, I actually referenced Hegel's work, but when we look at Hegel's idea of the thesis and the antithesis, I see the Les Paul as the thesis, even though it came later. But the reason why is because it represents everything that is and was in the guitar. So it's a violin carved top with flame maple like a Stradivarius is, right? It was a lacquer finish on the instrument. It was traditional instrument woods, mahogany, glued in neck joint. It was 3 and 3 tuners. It was very much from the tradition. And when Leo Fender came along with the Tele and then the Stratocaster, um, it's a bolt-on neck, it's 6 in line, it's car paint and plastics. It's the antithesis of, the instrument makers at the time would have said, they're
Right.
not a luthier, that's bullshit. It's factory bullshit. They make that just like they make your refrigerator or your car, and that was the antithesis of it. But then when Eddie Van Halen came along, we take these two things and we synthesize them, right? He pulls out the things he likes from the Les Paul and the things from the Stratocaster, and he mashes them together. And ultimately, we end up with brands like Paul Reed Smith, which is literally a Les Paul Strat.
Yep.
He kind of reconciles the balance issues and scale length of the Les Paul, and kind of Fenderizes a Les Paul, really. And the reason I say that, because you could say it the other way around, is because when I chart it out, now I have a Les Paul, a Stratocaster, and the middle point I'll have PRS, ESP Horizon, all this middle ground stuff that's basically the blending of the two. and I gave everything a value. So I said we can all agree that Fender is 6 in line and Gibson is 3 and 3. We can agree it's a bolt-on neck and a set neck. We can agree humbuckers, single coils, all the stuff that nobody would argue about, right? And I gave them all a value of 1. And then I started to chart out other guitars. And what you see is once you sort of reconcile that center point, all of the evolution then goes towards Fender. Anything that's coming off of Gibson is directly in line, meaning it's just like it but cheaper than, or just like it
Gotcha.
but better than. So you might take like an Eastman or a Collings, right? So one is just like it but cheaper than, one is just like it but better than. I know it's subjective, but the point is they sell on high quality, right? A brand like Collings does, and so, but there's no evolution happening off of it. And then you take anybody who's really evolving, from a Dingwall or a Strandberg or a Klein or, Steinberg or whatever it is, and you realize they're employing industrial design techniques, and it's all evolving towards Leo Fender. And what was interesting is there's multiple steps along the way here, away from Gibson, but there's a chasm between the center point and Gibson. There's literally nothing in the middle on the chart. And I've drawn 2 conclusions on this. One is that they are the company who most fiercely protects any patent they have. Even if it's not enforceable, they will send a letter, and that letter is the thing that scares most people away from even trying. Okay. Yep. And so I can't tell you how many times I've got a freaked out guitar maker call me up or email me, Jamie, I got a letter from Gibson. What am I going to do? Right. It's happened so many times in my life. And some of them have fought it and won. Some of them just bowed out and said, I make enough money doing other models that I don't need to do that.
Right.
And they just went away from it. The second part is I didn't understand why they continue to sell so well on this functional model, because they sell really well. People love them. They really love them. Right. And so I'm not trying to say anything bad against Gibson here, to be clear. I'm just trying to understand the information when I chart it and see what happens. And I was talking to some industrial designers I know over in Portugal, and we were talking about sort of a form follows function thing. And I said, but these are dysfunctional. As a matter of fact, when you categorize Fender, you have balance. And when you put a Gibson electric guitar up there, there's not a single Gibson guitar that balances electric. So on a design principle, imbalance belongs to Gibson. So if a guitar doesn't have balance, it's point Gibson. If a guitar does have balance, it's point Fender. If it has ergonomics, it's point Leo Fender, not ergonomic, point Gibson. And when it gets really ridiculous, like a Moneric guitar, I don't know if you've ever seen those. They look like a living fireball. They have all these crazy shapes, and they will literally do a guitar that has carved wooden flames and such. But when you see that every single time, it's mahogany, flame maple top, humbuckers, Tune-o-matic, 3 and 3.
Gotcha.
So it's a further extension, and it's an exploitation of the icon. And so I realized that it's really kind of, the function is a religious function. It's the exploitation of an icon. It's not a practical function.
Gotcha.
Long story long, what the function is really important. And you can continue to sell a brand on making patron saints. You might have noticed the Gibson guitar brand has made signature model guitars for everybody who never played a Gibson guitar in the early 80s in the last few years. These are people we don't even associate with the brand, but they've canonized them, and they've made new saints, to the altar. They literally had a throne, the Gibson throne. They make statues.
They did have a good,
They make statues. They had a hotel. There's all sorts of things in their image. And if you make a golden calf in their image, they will try and burn you at the stake. They act like a medieval Catholic church with the religious fervor. And so I know, here you go, James getting sued now.
Gibson will not be sponsoring this podcast.
Yeah. But that's what I realized is you have to do that if you're not going to evolve. If you're going to,
well, they tried robot guitars and whatnot, but they failed at their attempt to evolve. But
Well, it doesn't mean you stop trying. So,
I know, I know.
you and I mentioned in our conversation at the NAM show, I mentioned Hoshino because Hoshino is one of the only legacy companies that just continues to constantly innovate and evolve. And if you take your eye off that innovation and just sort of relax on your past successes, you'll become a legacy company who goes through periods where your sales spike when we're loving the golden years in the Make America Great Again
Yep.
years. But in the
Nice.
future forward sort of ideas, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, like, there are
Oh,
people
sure.
who everything is better the way it was, right? And then there are people where, we're always looking forward. And that was the Hope campaign, the
Right.
idea of a greater America with a healthcare system and with blah, 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 whatever it was. And the American politics always flipped between these two things. Before Hope was put prayer
Sure.
back in schools, and before that was Clinton, and back and forth, right? And so your sales will go in those cycles, the same cycles
Yep.
as the culture is going in. So when we're looking at the golden years, historical brands like Gibson and Martin are going up. They're selling more and more. But when we're futurists and we're excited about landing on the moon or Teslas or
Right.
whatever it is, that's when all the tech is spiking, spiking,
Right.
spiking at that
Parker
point in
sells more
time.
guitars
Yeah,
when that's
right,
the
right,
case.
right.
Yeah.
And so just that idea of what it is we value and what the function is. The function isn't always a mechanical function. Sometimes it's an
Right.
iconic or religious function. And that brings me all the way back to the record industry,
Yep.
where there are lots of musicians who talk about they just want to be heard. They just want people to be able to hear their music. And if that's your function, streaming works very well. You can put the platform out there. If you need to make a living doing it,
Different story.
you probably need to find a different business model. But if you just want music to be heard, it's easier to get your music heard today than it ever has been, I think. You might tell me otherwise. There might be
No,
people who
no,
have
100%
something out
yes.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the same for everyone else. So there's so much music out there. How do
That's
you
the problem.
distinguish yourself? How do you succeed in drawing attention? You know? Yeah.
When you figure that one out, let me know. We'll start a
Well,
business around that.
we do it every day. Didn't you come to
Yeah.
the Boutique Guitar Showcase at NAM?
I did. I did.
and and
And it was
and you saw.
amazing.
Yeah, but you also saw big art installations there. You saw massive
Yep.
angel wings, and you saw
Yep.
AI inspired, pieces and such. And I do those because I know that we have to succeed in making a noise and drawing attention.
Yep.
And every day I coach artists, artisans through these sorts of ideas about how are you going to distinguish yourself when there's so many amazing guitar makers out there, right? It's the same thing in
Yep.
every field. How do you
Sure,
distinguish
man.
yourself as an engineer? How do you distinguish yourself as a teacher, as a musician? Yeah.
Yep. And it's not always just, for better or worse, it's not always just about the music, which is, you know, that the extra work that's got to be put in to kind of get you there. So agreed, man.
Yeah. There's the most important part. We discussed a little bit on sound, and that sound takes three things. It takes um, motion or energy in time. That's how we measure the difference in the energy
Mhm.
movements. But it also takes perception. And anytime we're communicating anything, don't forget that receiver, that person who is perceiving your art form. If you don't want to make any money and you just want to make art for yourself, you're independently wealthy, make whatever the hell you want. But if your goal is to make a living in the arts, you better be making something that someone else wants to invest in. That receiver is a very important part of that. That doesn't mean selling out. It means,
Right.
when we're talking to each other, we're constantly negotiating our relationship. We're negotiating what we have in common. Oh, I said that. He didn't really care about that. But when I said this, he
Right.
liked that. And so you go in that direction, right? That's not being inauthentic, but it's finding those
No.
points in common.
Yeah, I completely agree. The alternate to that is make whatever the hell you want to make musically, and then because no matter what you make, there are going to be people out there that will appreciate it. Right? You just have to find them, right? So it's like it's either do better at making something that is going to address a wider group of people more easily, and or be able to find your niche are the people that respect and love what you do. So, and both of those things are possible. It just is work.
Do you believe that? Do you believe that
Yes.
anything you make, you'll find someone who likes it?
Okay, not anything, but like it. Well, I actually these days I don't know. I mean, I work on a lot of music. For most of the music that I work on is for major labels, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And I it's less so right now, but especially like 3 or 4 years ago, there was a period where I was getting stuff from major label artists, right? Not people that you would all know, and I not people I even knew. That
Hmm.
was I was like, this is garbage. This is like the worst recorded, worst performed, worst anything I've ever heard put out by even an independent label, much less a major, well-known international big three record label. And I went to the just I knew the A&R pretty well that was sending me this work to master in this
Hmm.
case, and I was like, can you
Hmm.
just I just have to ask, like, what this is, like, not even lo-fi, this is beyond lo-fi, like this is not even a
Hmm.
competent artist from a lot of people's perspective. And he was like, we have such with TikTok, with a lot of other things, we have this appetite for artists that people really feel like they can be. That's not this wide gap between the fan and like Mariah Carey's vocal, as an example, or pick your Steve
Hmm.
Vai or
Hmm.
something like that. But they feel like it's just 1 degree of separation away from them. And I was like, in the social media, in this person's opinion, had driven a lot of that, because I feel like I can then go out there and kind of do something similar. And I was like, oh, that's fascinating. So in this case, something that I would barely even stick a music tag on, was some of the stuff became incredibly popular, by the way.
Hmm.
But so that makes me wonder, there is, I think, a market for just about everything, that someone can express, if you find, however big or very small the group is going to be, that's going to appreciate that. So I don't know, weird example, but yeah, at this point, I'm tempted to say, yeah, there's a market for everything to some degree. There's appreciation for almost everything out there. Hell,
Yeah.
people love Baby Shark, right? There's millions of people who appreciate that song, even if that's not your jam. So it's kind of like, it also depends upon, things that you and I might not appreciate, right? Somebody else is going to have a wildly different opinion. That's one of the beautiful things about art, and about,
Hmm.
where
Hmm.
people are at in their own lives, and blah blah blah, right? Is that you never know what's going to hit somebody.
Yeah. 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 I mean, I think it's a beautiful concept because I just love the idea that there's someone for everyone, like that's
I know, it's glass half full, glass half full. Let me have that. Come on, man. There might only
no,
be one other person.
yeah, I think, I think it's really, it's all right. I'm going to share with you
Okay,
a little story. I don't know why I'm going to share it, but I'm going to share it anyways. Remind me, I was going to this like Irish Keeley style thing that was happening with my kids' high school. One of the teachers was doing it. And I thought, just support the local musicians, do something. That'll be nice. We'll go and do this. And I met this lady who apparently was a substantial folk singer in the Toronto area in the 1960s. She came out to it and we hit it off. She was really nice. And she was playing a gig at this place in Toronto. And so I went down to the place. It turns out this was a Unitarian church of some sort. I'd never been to a Unitarian church before. I didn't know what to expect, and whatever. It's still a stage and a microphone and someone playing guitar. And they had like an open mic before she went on. And a guy got up there and he talked a bit like Emo Phillips. You remember Emo Phillips? I don't know. He had this
sure.
crazy sort of voice, which I presume was put on. I don't think this guy was putting it on. And he pulled out a classic tape deck, the ones that were like 6 inches wide and like they had the speaker
Sure.
at the back and the buttons at the front, right? And he puts the microphone up to it. I'm like, oh wow, what's going to happen? And he starts talking about, it's not always the dad that leaves. Sometimes it's the mom. And he sings Kelly Clarkson's "Because of You" over top of the cassette deck.
Whoa. Cool.
It was awful. It was
Interesting.
moving. It
Yeah.
was like a moment I wanted to laugh. I wanted to cry. Like I felt like, is this a skit? Like I don't know what's
Right.
happening
Am I being
here.
put on here? Like, what is? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm
That's
being
it.
punked. Where's Ashton Kutcher?
Yeah.
Like what's
Yeah.
but going to these kind of Keeleys and stuff where it was an open environment for anyone to play. There were competent musicians there. there were professional musicians there. There were also people who, I don't know if auto-tune is enough,
Yeah.
but they expressed themselves, and it was a lovely moment. And so, I say that because I've had the experience where you listen to something which should be possibly cringeworthy, but yet was valuable.
Yeah,
And
100%. That's an
so,
interesting point.
yeah. So I want to believe. I want to believe what you say.
Right. Good. We'll just
Now,
agree to, yeah, there's someone for everyone. I love it. It's a good
yeah.
it's a
Now,
good
now,
theme for today's chat.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Now, on the economically viable part, I talk about this as sort of concentric circles when I'm talking with guitar makers who want to be a part of what we do. Say, listen, you can if you make a functioning guitar or a mostly functioning guitar, you'll probably have some friends, family, people locally who will want to buy a guitar from you. You know, if you make a really good guitar, you'll probably sell some in your local city in your surrounding area. But you have to sort of have these small groups, and then the better job you do, and the more you distinguish yourself, the greater the possibility of your sales are. And I mostly
Right.
work with people. Well, the point of what we do is that we have a global business where if you're making extremely rare 6 pieces a year, very unusual guitars at a high quality, and they sell for 30, $40,000, you can't try and sell them all within the city of Greenville,
Right.
North Carolina. Like, that's not going to work, right? And so you need a really big net to cast at that point in time, the more niche that you are.
Right. Agreed.
And so the global business there. And so I think this is yeah, it's been an interesting conversation, Daniel. Thank you for having it with me.
Yeah. I
Um,
think we went in a bunch of different directions: business, AI, guitar making, et cetera, et cetera. So cool, man. I enjoyed it.
yeah, for me, that's why I called it life with strings attached. It's just life. And the reality is, even when I visit, the MoMA in New York, I'm still thinking about a guitar somehow. It's just
Right.
just my reality, of where I came from. But if I could ask you, in your, well, as a teacher, as an expert in the industry, and as somebody who clearly is a, a human. And I don't know there's a better
Clearly.
way to say that. I'm sorry.
Nice.
I just mean that you expressed a level of humanity in our last few minutes of conversation that I really appreciate. Um, if you have some advice for people who just are artists, musicians, it doesn't matter. The types of people who might come to your class, or the types of people who might come to one of our lectures or panels or whatever it happens to be. You know, with all your experience, what's the little jewel you might leave for them
Oh
of
man,
advice?
that's hard. I've okay. So I mean, the advice that I give a lot of my students and people that just come in general about asking about how they can separate themselves and blah blah blah, regardless of what they're doing, but it was music specifically. I've just, don't be afraid to break things. Don't be afraid. It's the number one lesson that I learned, and we talked this just to wrap up our chat today, because this is what we started talking about at the beginning.
Hmm.
You asked me what I learned from, or got out of situations with my mentors, my early day mentors, people like Adrian Blue, even later on a little bit Trent Reznor, like
Yeah.
is don't be afraid to break things. Like, look at how things are being done, figure out how you can leverage technology as an example for ways maybe it wasn't intended for, to set yourself apart from everybody else. And that doesn't mean necessarily that if you're a guitar player, you need to incorporate MIDI pickups and other things. I'm even talking about the way that you use social media, or the way that you use Patreon, like, or whatever, literally whatever it is, right? Don't be afraid to kind of think outside the box, not only in your playing, but in the way you approach your business, because those are the people who tend to get opportunities, because you're doing something that not everybody else is doing. And that's, that is of a tremendous value. So I think, it's easy advice to give people. It's hard to find your specific lane where that makes sense. But in my career, at least, it's been 100% the thing, whether musically, my work in AI, whatever, that's allowed me to kind of grow and be who I am and who I'm hopefully becoming. So
Hmm. Hmm. Great. Yeah. Wonderful.
there you
it,
go. My sage advice for the day.
no, I really appreciate that. Thank you. Is there just for your own work, is there something that you would want people to know about right now and to check out the, recent things that you're up to?
Oh man, nothing specific, honestly. Like, if you're ever interested in kind of reaching out to me or following kind of what I'm doing, I don't use social media a ton, but LinkedIn is my jam, and my secret of my success has been LinkedIn. That would be the other thing I owe a lot to. And if I'll say this, my last piece of advice: if you're in music and you don't think LinkedIn is useful for you, you are incredibly wrong, because all the music supervisors, all the managers, all the front of house, and there's a lot of people there that aren't maybe an artist to collaborate with, but that operate on the business side that can get eyes and ears on your music. So I would recommend it. But if you ever want to catch up with what I'm working on, whether it's films I'm mixing or mastering, or music production stuff, that would be the place to go. So just look me up there.
Okay, great.
Cool. Well,
And
thank
we'll
you, man. I
include
appreciate you having me.
oh,
Oh, okay.
you're very welcome. I appreciate you coming on, man. It's great. We met just about a year ago at a future music instrument conversation at the NAM
Yep.
show, and then again in New York. And I've enjoyed every time we've had a chance to talk. So
Yeah,
thank you
ditto.
very much. And I look forward to doing it again sometime.
All right, Jamie, man. Appreciate you.
Thank you for watching and listening. You can find more episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts. And a special thanks to those who support us on Patreon. It's your support that enables us to do this work.